There is a scene that history books do not show. It is 1656 Amsterdam, a closed room inside the Portuguese synagogue, 12 men sitting in a semicircle, candles lit even though it is daytime. And in the center, standing, a 23-year-old young man who will hear in the next few minutes the most violent words that a community can pronounce against one of its own. They will not arrest him. They will not beat him. They will do something that, for that people who spent centuries being hunted by the Inquisition, was considered worse than physical death. They will erase him. The Cherem, the Jewish excommunication, that was read that day against Baruch de Spinoza, is the most brutal document of its kind that exists in the entire history of European Judaism. Historians have spent centuries studying that text, trying to understand what exactly that young man had done or said to deserve such language. The document speaks of curses, of absolute isolation. It prohibits any member of the community from speaking to him, from coming within 2 meters of him, from reading anything he had written. It even prohibits being under the same roof. And the most intriguing part, it never explains the reason clearly, as if naming Spinoza's thought were as dangerous as the thought itself. The young man heard everything. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not kneel. He did not cry, at least not in public. He walked out the door, crossed the streets of Amsterdam, and never returned. He was 23 years old, and the only thing he took with him was the question that had started it all. What was that question? It was not about God. It was not about the existence or non-existence of the divine. It was something more specific, more surgical, more difficult to answer without an entire structure of certainties beginning to crack at the sides. The question was this: if the miracles of the Bible prove that the God of the Hebrews is the only true God, what do we do with the miracles of others? Simple as that. Devastating as that. Because the others existed. No one could deny that, and Spinoza had read about them with that silent obsession that was his way of existing in the world. Amsterdam was at that moment the most cosmopolitan city in Europe. Ships were arriving from all over bringing spices, slaves, ivory, and accounts. Accounts of worlds that the sacred texts did not mention because their authors never knew they existed. Accounts of a wise man who had sat under a tree, closed his eyes, and when he opened them 49 days had passed, and he knew things that no human being should know. Accounts of priestesses in Egypt, who performed healings that Greek doctors documented with astonishment and never managed to replicate. Accounts of texts written in Mesopotamia 2,000 years before Moses that described, word for word, a universal flood, a huge boat, animals saved in pairs, a dove sent to find dry land. Accounts of monks in Tibet who chose the exact moment of their own death, whose bodies remained warm and undecomposed for days after being clinically dead, whose disciples stood guard around them, waiting for signs that, according to reports, invariably arrived. Accounts of indigenous healers on the American continent, a continent that the Bible does not mention anywhere, who descended to the world of the dead, conversed with ancestors, and returned with verifiable information about people they had never known. What do you do with all of this? The official answer was simple: you ignore it, or you explain it as the work of the devil, or you call it primitive superstition of peoples who have not yet received the true revelation. Spinoza could not do that, not because he was naive, not because he believed everything he read, but because there was in those accounts a consistency that the explanation of the devil did not resolve, that the label of superstition did not cover, that the argument of incomplete revelation did not reach. The consistency was this: in cultures that never touched, in languages that never crossed, in completely different historical moments, human beings were having the same type of experience, describing the same type of contact with what was beyond comprehension, and keeping that experience in the same narrative forms: virgin who conceives, God who dies and returns, flood that erases and restarts, wise man who ascends and descends, sacrifice that saves, light that tears through darkness, again, 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 as if they were not different stories about different deities, as if they were the same story told by those who do not know that others are also telling it. This is where Spinoza becomes truly dangerous. Not when he denies God. He never denied God. This is one of the greatest distortions that history has committed against him. But when he proposes something much more radical than atheism, he proposes that God is too great to fit into any human tradition, that if the divine is indeed infinite, and all traditions agree that it is, then any human group that claims to have a monopoly on divine revelation is, at the very moment of that claim, contradicting the very definition of what it claims to believe. Because the infinite has no monopoly. The infinite does not choose a people, a book, a language, a historical moment, and leave the rest of the world in darkness waiting for its turn. The infinite appears everywhere there is a human being willing to stop, to silence, and to look honestly at what is beyond what they can name. And when you begin to see the miracles of other traditions with these eyes, not as a threat, not as competition, not as blasphemy, but as windows opening to the same vastness that your own tradition tries to describe, something happens to you that cannot be undone. The world becomes larger. Faith, if you have it, becomes more honest. And the questions you never had the courage to ask out loud begin to seem less dangerous and more necessary than any answer you have ever received. This is why you are here. 6 miracles, 6 traditions, 6 moments when humanity touched the inexplicable and kept that touch in a story that crossed millennia to reach you now. Let's look at each of them through the lens of the man who was expelled for doing exactly that, and who never, not once in the rest of his life, regretted having done so. There is a word in Latin that Spinoza used with almost surgical precision, and that most modern translations of his work fail to capture correctly. The word is sub specie eternitatis. Literally translated, it means under the perspective of eternity. But that says nothing. It is too beautiful and too vague. What Spinoza meant by this expression was something much more concrete, much more demanding, much more disturbing for those who actually try to practice it as a way of thinking. He meant, look at things as they are, not as you were taught to want them to be, without the filter of the nation, without the filter of language, without the filter of family tradition, without the fear of what others will think if you come to a conclusion different from what was expected of you. Look at reality as if you could step out of your own body, your own century, your own culture, and see everything from a point that does not belong to any specific place. It is almost impossible. He knew it was almost impossible, but he spent his whole life trying, and the field where this attempt produced the most explosive results, the results that no one was prepared to receive in the 17th century, and that much of the world is still not prepared to receive today, was precisely the field of miracles. What is a miracle? The answer that most people would immediately give is a supernatural event, a violation of the laws of nature, something that could not happen according to the rules of the physical world, but that happens because God intervenes directly, suspending those rules for a moment to demonstrate his power or his mercy. This definition seems solid, but Spinoza examined it with the same patience with which he polished the lenses in his workshop, looking for the microscopic imperfections that the careless eye does not see, but that, projected onto a finished lens, distort everything. And he found a fundamental imperfection. If God is the creator and sustainer of all the laws of nature, if it is by the will and nature of God that a body falls when you let it go, that the sun rises in the east, that the seasons follow one another, that the heart beats and blood circulates, then God violating those laws would be, in practice, contradicting himself. He would be undoing the very order he created. He would be admitting that his original creation was inadequate, that it needed pinpoint corrections, that the design of the universe had flaws that only emergency patches could fix. This does not seem like omniscience. It resembles improvisation. A God who improvises is a much smaller God than the one that monotheistic traditions claim to worship. Spinoza then proposes something different, something that most people hear and at first feel as an emptiness, as if someone were taking something precious from their hands. But when examined more calmly, it reveals a greatness that the conventional definition of miracle has never been able to reach. He proposes that miracles are not violations of the laws of nature. They are moments when nature reveals a depth that we did not yet know. They are points where reality shows a layer of itself that was hidden, not because God chose to hide it and has now decided to reveal it, but because human consciousness, at that specific moment, in that specific individual, under those specific conditions, reached a sufficient opening to perceive what has always been there. The miracle is not the exception to the rule. It is the rule showing itself to be deeper than we thought. This distinction, seemingly philosophical, seemingly technical, has consequences that turn the world upside down. Because if miracles are supernatural violations of natural laws, then they are by definition rare, localized, and the exclusive property of those who receive them. God appears here, opens the sea here, speaks to this specific people, and the others are left without. It is a system of divine favoritism that constantly needs elaborate theological justifications to explain why the infinite chose to manifest itself in such geographically restricted ways. But if miracles are moments of profound revelation of nature itself, if they are reality showing itself to be deeper, then they have no owner. They have no address. They do not speak a specific language. They can happen in a cave in Nepal just as much as in a desert in Sinai. They can happen in the 8th century BC just as much as in the 1st century AD. They can happen to a Hindu prince, to a Galilean fisherman, to an Amazonian healer, to a Tibetan monk, to an Egyptian priest, to a Christian mystic in medieval Spain. And when they happen in different places, with different people, in historical moments with no connection between them, and yet produce experiences described with a disturbing similarity, then the question you need to ask is no longer, which one is the true one? The question you need to ask is, what exactly is this thing that is happening in all these places at the same time? It was with this question that Spinoza began to read. And what he found, fragments arriving at the ports of Amsterdam, reports from missionaries, texts from travelers, manuscripts circulating clandestinely among Dutch intellectuals who had contacts all over the world, was enough to completely reorganize the way he understood the religious history of humanity. He found 6 stories that he could not ignore. Not just any 6 stories. 6 specific moments documented, described by eyewitnesses or by oral traditions of impressive consistency that presented to the honest observer an inescapable question. If you believe that the Red Sea opened and accept this event as proof of a power that transcends the laws of the natural world, then you need, intellectually, to look at these 6 moments with the same degree of openness that you use to look at Moses. Or you need to be honest about the fact that it is not the nature of the event that convinces you, it is the identity of who is at the center of it. And this honesty, this willingness to look at your own criterion of belief with the same severity that you use to examine the beliefs of others, was, for Spinoza, the only truly religious act that a human being could practice. Everything else was politics. Let's start with the first one. And starting with the first is to begin with the one that, of all 6, is probably the most well-known in the contemporary Western world and at the same time the most misunderstood. Because Western popular culture has absorbed the surface of this story and left the substance intact, untouched, preserved within texts that most people have not read and will not read. The story of a man who sat under a tree, who remained there, motionless, for 49 days. That when he opened his eyes, something had changed in him that no word in any human language can accurately describe, and that what changed in him began, in the following centuries, to change the world. His birth name was Siddhartha Gautama, prince, son of a king of the Shakya clan in a region that today corresponds to southern Nepal. Born, according to traditions, at some point between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, historians still debate the exact date with an intensity that says a lot about how much this figure continues to disturb any attempt to domesticate her within a safe chronology. What the sources agree on is this: he grew up inside a palace. He grew up protected by his father's decision from any contact with human suffering. There was a prophecy. Prophecies appear everywhere in all traditions, as if the supernatural insisted on announcing itself before arriving, that said that this boy would either be a great king or be something that no king can be, a completely awakened being. The father wanted the king. He built around his son a world without pain, without illness, without old age, without death. Servants were instructed to remove from the prince's sight any sick person, any elder, any corpse. And it worked, until the day it no longer worked. Siddhartha left the palace. There are versions that say it was out of curiosity. Others say he was guided by forces he could not control. And he found that very afternoon the four things from which his father had tried to protect him for decades: an elder bent under the weight of years, a sick person consumed by fever, a corpse being carried for cremation, and, in the most disturbing possible contrast to the first three, a mendicant monk with a shaved head and simple robes, walking in absolute peace amidst all that. 4 images, 4 revelations, and a question that would not go away: if pain is inevitable, if old age is inevitable, if death is inevitable, what exactly are we doing with the time we have before all this arrives? That night, Siddhartha left the palace. He left his wife, he left his newborn son, he left everything that the world considers valuable, and spent the following years seeking an answer that none of the spiritual teachers of the time could satisfactorily provide. He tried extreme asceticism. He even reached the point of eating a single rice grain per day. He became so thin that, according to the texts, he could touch his spine by pressing his abdomen, and he found nothing. Not the answer he was looking for. Then he did something that, within the spiritual context of the time, was almost scandalous. He decided to eat. He decided that mortifying the body was not the way. He sat under a fig tree, the Ficus religiosa, which Buddhists still call the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, on the banks of the Niranjana River, in what is now the state of Bihar, India. And he decided not to rise until he found the answer. What happened in those 49 hours, or 49 days? The sources vary, and the variation itself says something about the nature of what is being described, is the central event of Buddhism. It is the equivalent of the Red Sea. It is the moment that divides history into before and after. The texts describe visions, temptations, the attack of Mara, the figure that represents attachment, desire, fear, everything that binds human consciousness in the cycle of suffering. They describe Siddhartha resisting attacks that were not physical, that were deeper than physical, that came from within and not from outside. And then they describe the moment when something opens. Not a voice from heaven, not a light descending from above, not an angel with a message. An internal opening, a comprehension so complete, so total, so different from anything that common language can express, that the Buddhist texts themselves admit with a rare honesty that what Siddhartha experienced at that moment cannot be conveyed in words. It can only be pointed to. Just as you point to the moon, the finger is not the moon. But without the finger you might never look in the right direction. What the texts point to is this: Siddhartha saw, at that moment under the Bodhi tree, the complete nature of reality. He saw the arising and passing away of all phenomena. He saw past lives, not as belief but as direct memory. He saw the law that governs suffering and saw, within that same law, the way out of suffering. And when the sun rose that morning, the man who opened his eyes was no longer Siddhartha Gautama. He was the Buddha, the awakened one. Here is where most Western analyses stop. The Buddha sat, meditated, became enlightened. Very beautiful, very inspiring. It becomes a calendar quote, a forearm tattoo, living room decor with that golden statue of a big-bellied figure that, by the way, does not. The historical Buddha. It is a completely different figure called Budai, a Chinese monk from the 10th century. But that is another subject. The point is, history looks beautiful when you keep it on the surface. It becomes disturbing when you go deeper. Because going deeper into this history means asking what exactly happened under that tree in terms that go beyond spiritual vocabulary and begin to enter a territory that neuroscience, quantum physics, and depth psychology are still, each in its own way, trying to map. And it also means asking the question that Spinoza would ask without hesitation: if this event, this awakening, this radical opening of consciousness, this contact with a dimension of reality that transcends the individual ego, if this event actually happened, then what is the structural difference between it and what Moses experienced on Mount Sinai. Not the difference in content, not the difference in theology, the structural difference. Because when you place the two accounts side by side and look at them through Spinoza's eyes, without the filter of prior fidelity to one or the other, what you find is not opposition. It is a mirror. Moses ascends the mountain. He spends 40 days without eating, without drinking. He comes into contact with something that cannot be looked at directly. The text itself says that no human being can see the face of God and continue to live. He descends, transformed, with a law, with an understanding of reality that the rest of the people do not have direct access to. They receive it mediated, filtered, translated by the figure of the prophet. Siddhartha sits under the tree. He stays for 49 days. He comes into contact with something that the texts admit cannot be described in human language. He rises transformed, with a teaching, with an understanding of reality that he spends the rest of his life trying to convey to people who did not experience what he experienced. They receive it mediated, filtered, translated by the figure of the awakened one. The structure is identical, the extreme isolation. Physical deprivation as a condition for an internal opening. The contact with something that exceeds the descriptive capacity of language. The irreversible transformation of the individual. The return with a message for the collective. The fundamental difficulty of transmitting direct experience to those who have not had it. Identical. And we are not talking about cultures that knew each other. We are not talking about historical influence, narrative borrowing, a text that read the other and was inspired. We are talking about two men in two different corners of the ancient world with no communication channel between them, living experiences that their own followers describe with the same words. Spinoza saw this, and instead of finding in it a threat to the credibility of either tradition, he found something he considered much more valuable, a clue about what human consciousness is capable of when pushed to its extreme limits, a clue about what lies on the other side of those limits. But there is something in the account of Buddha's awakening that goes beyond the narrative structure parallel to Sinai, something that Buddhist texts describe with a richness of detail that has led modern researchers, not philosophers, not theologians, but neuroscientists with electroencephalographs and magnetic resonance imaging, to ask questions that no 20th century science manual had predicted. The texts describe Buddha, during the awakening, perceiving the nature of the interdependence of all phenomena, not as a concept, as direct experience. The feeling, if feeling is the right word, which it probably isn't, that there is no real separation between the observer and the observed, between the self and the world, between the interior and the exterior, that these distinctions, which seem absolutely obvious and fundamental to ordinary consciousness, are constructions, superimpositions that the mind makes over a reality that, in itself, knows no boundaries. This was described in the 5th century before Christ in Sanskrit by people who had never heard of quantum physics. But in 1927, a Danish physicist named Niels Bohr was describing, in mathematical and experimental terms, something structurally identical. The discovery that at the subatomic level, the separation between observer and observed does not exist. That the act of measuring an electron alters the electron. That the boundary we assume exists between what is inside and what is outside the experiment is a functional illusion, not an absolute reality. Bohr was so disturbed by this, by the philosophical depth of what physics had discovered, that he spent years studying Eastern philosophy, seeking a language that physics had not yet developed. The symbol he chose for the coat of arms he received when he was knighted by the Danish crown was the Taoist yin-yang. Because he felt that Eastern traditions had arrived by a completely different path at a territory that Western physics was just beginning to map. Would this disturb Spinoza? No. It would confirm exactly what he had proposed. That reality has a depth that no isolated tradition can fully capture, and that when different traditions reach that depth, whether through meditation, scientific experimentation, or prophetic revelation, they arrive at the same place. Because there is only one place to arrive at. Now, before we continue to the second miracle, Because there are 5 more to go. I need to pause here for a moment. Because you have made it this far, and that is not as common as it seems. Most people who start a video about philosophy, about comparative religion, about Spinoza, abandon it in the first few minutes. They go for something easier, faster, more digestible. The algorithm is full of easy answers, comfortable certainties, voices that confirm what you already believe and spare you the work of truly thinking. You stayed. That says something about who you are. You are the kind of person who can deliberately stay uncomfortable, who can hold a question without rushing to the first available answer, who can look at the tradition you love, at whatever it may be, with the same honest gaze you use to look at others. That is Spinoza's gaze, and it is rare. So I make you a simple invitation. Write in the comments now. Just one thing. Which of the 2 experiences, Moses' Sinai or Buddha's Bodhi, resonates more with you? Not which you believe is true. Which resonates? Which comes closest to something you have felt yourself? In a moment of silence, in a loss, on a night that had no explanation, in an instant when reality seemed deeper than usual. Right. Because this conversation becomes much larger when you enter it. And if you are not yet part of this channel, if you got here by chance through the algorithm, through someone's recommendation, consider subscribing now, not because I will ask you for anything more, but because what comes after this video follows exactly in that direction. Stories that school did not tell, questions that religion does not encourage, connections that permanently change the way you see the world. The bell is here. It is a 3-second gesture. Now, let us return, because we still need to talk about the strangest moment of Buddha's entire journey. It is not the awakening, it is what happened after the awakening. The texts describe Buddha sitting under the tree for weeks after the enlightenment, simply, in silence, without moving, without teaching, without going anywhere. And the accounts say, and here is where Buddhist texts enter a territory that has no easy parallel in any other tradition, that during this period, deities descended to him to ask him to teach, to share what he had discovered. Because without this sharing, the discovery would die with him, and humanity would once again be left without the map. Buddha hesitated. He hesitated because he knew that what he had experienced could not be transmitted in words, that any description would be a betrayal of the original, that people would hear the words and confuse the finger with the moon. But he agreed, and spent the next 45 years teaching, not building a temple, not establishing an army, not conquering territories in the name of a new divine order, walking, sitting with people, answering questions, teaching in different ways for different people, because he discovered that the same truth needs different clothing depending on who is listening. When he died at 80, surrounded by disciples, the last thing he said was an instruction that completely contradicts what most religions ask of their followers. He said, "Do not believe in me. Test for yourself. Not faith, not devotion, not obedience, personal investigation, direct experimentation, the authority of experience over the authority of tradition." Spinoza read this and recognized it, because it was what he had proposed, in philosophical language. In his theological political treatise, the truth does not need external authority to sustain itself. That any truth that only exists while you do not question it is not truth, it is dependence. 2 men, 22 centuries apart. The same thought. Now we need to go to a place that most people, when they hear the name, immediately think of blood, destruction, in something that cannot be sacred because it is too violent to be divine. Let's talk about the goddess Kali, and we will do this carefully, with the precision of Spinoza, because Kali is perhaps the most dramatic example of what happens when a culture looks at reality without any comfort filter, without any desire to make God palatable, manageable, psychologically reassuring, and represents what it sees with an honesty that the West has never had the courage to achieve. The canonical image of Kali is this: black or dark blue skin, 4 arms, in one hand a sword, in another the severed head of a demon dripping blood, in a third hand open upwards in a gesture of protection, in the fourth the same gesture of blessing, the tongue sticking out red, a necklace of human heads around her neck, a skirt made of severed arms. She stands over the prostrate body of her own husband, the god Shiva. If you grew up within an Abrahamic tradition, Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, your immediate reaction to this image is likely one of repulsion or incomprehension. How can this be sacred? How can such a figure represent the divine? It seems the opposite of the divine. It seems demonic. And this is exactly where Spinoza comes in. Because Spinoza would say, with that geometric patience that was his hallmark, that your repulsion is not a perception of reality. It is a reflection of the culture in which you were formed. A reflection of a specific tradition that decided, at some point in its history, that God must be represented only under the attributes of good, light, order, mercy, and that everything dark, chaotic, destructive must be attributed to an opposing force, to the enemy, to evil. But this decision, and it is a decision, not an objective perception of reality, has a cost. The cost is that it produces an incomplete God. Hinduism, particularly the Shakta tradition that venerates Kali as the supreme expression of the divine, starts from a radically different premise. The premise is this: if the divine created everything that exists, then the divine includes everything that exists. It includes creation and destruction. It includes order and chaos. It includes life and death. It includes what is beautiful and what is terrifying. And any representation of the divine that captures only half of this equation is not representing the divine. It is representing a human desire for the divine to be only what comforts us. Kali is the refusal of that desire. She is the divine without a comfort filter. And when you understand this, when you stop looking at the image with the eyes of someone who has been taught that God must look like a loving father with a white beard, something in the image transforms. What seemed like gratuitous violence begins to look like something else. It begins to look like cosmological honesty. The mythology of Kali has many versions, but the most famous narrates a battle between the gods and demons that the gods were losing. The demon Raktabija had a specific and impossible-to-defeat power. Every drop of his blood that touched the ground transformed into a new demon identical to him. Every wound the gods inflicted multiplied the enemy. The war had no possible outcome within the conventional rules of combat. Then Kali entered. She entered and fought in a way that no other god had attempted. She drank Raktabija's blood before it touched the ground. Every drop directly from the wound. She prevented the multiplication, destroyed the demon, saved creation. But here is the detail that superficial commentaries always ignore. After the battle, Kali did not stop. She continued destroying. The ecstasy of combat had taken hold of her to such an extent that she began to threaten to destroy not only the demons, but the gods themselves, the cosmos itself. The excess of destructive force without direction was becoming a danger, and the only being capable of stopping her was Shiva. Her husband lay down on the ground in front of her. Kali stepped on him without realizing, in the midst of the destructive frenzy. And at that moment, feeling under her foot the body of the being she loved, she stopped. The tongue sticking out is, according to Hindu commentators, a gesture of surprise and shame. She had stepped on her own husband. And here comes the layer that Spinoza would have found most interesting about the entire mythology. Some Hindu commentators say that Shiva was not unconscious. He was lucid, aware, and had deliberately chosen to lie down in front of Kali, because he knew it was the only way to stop her. Because love, even conjugal love, even the most intimate and domestic love, is the only force in the cosmos capable of containing pure destruction. What the mythology is describing, in image, is a physics of the cosmos, the destructive force, and which is real, which is necessary, which is an integral part of creation because without destruction there is no renewal, needs a counterbalance. And that counterbalance is not repression, it is not denial. It is not the attempt to pretend that destruction does not exist or that it is the work of the demon. It is love that lies in the path of destruction and looks it in the eyes. Spinoza would have read this and recognized something he had proposed in philosophical language in his Ethics, that emotions are not opposed to reason, but that reason without understanding emotions is blind, and that the path to freedom, does not pass through the denial of the most violent internal forces, but through their understanding. That Kali within you, this force that wants to destroy when it is in pain, when it is afraid, when it has been betrayed, is not the demon that needs to be exorcised. It is an energy that needs to be understood, directed, put in contact with what it loves. Shiva on the ground is that contact. But there is another dimension to this story that goes beyond individual psychology and enters a cosmology that parallels, in a disturbing way, what modern physics has discovered about the nature of the universe. The Hindu texts that describe Kali, especially the Devi Mahatmya and later Tantric texts, propose that destruction is not the opposite of creation, it is the condition of creation, that the same act that destroys one form releases the energy necessary for another form to arise, not as consolation, as a physical description. And in 1965, the Belgian astrophysicist Georges Lemaitre had proposed decades earlier, and was being increasingly confirmed by astronomical data, that the entire universe had emerged from a single point of infinite density, a singularity, an explosion, a destruction that was, simultaneously, the creation of everything. The Big Bang is Kali, not as a poetic metaphor, as structure. The cosmos was born from an event of absolute energy and chaos. Stars form and explode, and the heavy elements released by their explosions are the material of which planets, oceans, human bodies are made. You are made of dead stars. Your existence depends on previous destructions of a scale that is beyond imagination. The Hindu priests who wrote about Kali 2,000 years ago did not have telescopes, they did not have particle accelerators, they did not have equations, but they arrived at the same place. And this pattern of independent arrivals at the same territory was what Spinoza saw as the most powerful evidence of all. Not evidence that any specific tradition was right. Evidence that reality has a nature that reveals itself to those who observe it honestly, regardless of the language or method used to observe. A British Assyriologist named George Smith is in the basement of the British Museum in London, leaning over fragments of clay tablets that had been excavated from the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire, destroyed in 612 BC, buried by time, rediscovered by British archaeologists in the 19th century. The tablets belong to the library of King Ashurbanipal, one of the largest collections of written texts from the ancient world, written in cuneiform, that wedge-shaped writing system pressed into wet clay that Smith had spent years learning to decipher. And then, on that afternoon in 1872, Smith reads something that makes his heart stop. He is reading a fragment of what will later be identified as part of a much larger text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, originally written in Akkadian around 1200 BC, but based on even older Sumerian traditions that date back to at least 2100 BC. And what he is reading is this: a man receives from a god the warning that a flood will destroy all humanity. The god instructs this man to build a boat of specific dimensions. The man embarks with his family and with animals. The flood covers the land. The boat lands on a mountain. The man releases birds to check if the land has dried. A dove is released, finds no place to land, returns. A second dove is released and does not return. Sign that the earth has dried up. The man descends from the boat. He offers a sacrifice. The god smells the sacrifice and makes a promise. Smith was so shaken by what he was reading that, according to reports from witnesses who were present that day at the museum, he began to undress in the middle of the room. He was not having a breakdown. He was having a revelation, because what he had found was the story of Noah's flood, written centuries before Genesis. When Smith published his discovery and the news spread, the reaction of the British religious community at the time was what you would expect: denial, rationalization, accusations of forgery. The Daily Telegraph funded a second expedition to Nineveh so that Smith could find the missing fragments, and he did. And the fragments confirmed everything. Noah's flood existed in Sumerian and Akkadian versions before it existed in Hebrew. The character is called Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Atrahasis in an even older text called the Epic of Atrahasis, dated to around 1700 BC. The correspondences with Genesis are so specific, not only the general event of the flood, but the details, the boat, the animals, the birds, the dove, the mountain, the sacrifice, the divine promise that the hypothesis of independent coincidence is statistically absurd. Something happened. Some memory was preserved, and this memory crossed cultures, languages, millennia, and reached us in different versions that preserve the same core with disturbing fidelity. But here is where conventional analysis stops and where Spinoza begins. Because most discussions about the flood of Gilgamesh get stuck on the question of priority. Who came first? Who copied whom? Did the Bible derive from the Epic of Gilgamesh? Did the Hebrews absorb Mesopotamian traditions during the Babylonian captivity? These are historian questions, legitimate, important, but they are not the most interesting questions. The most interesting question is, what exactly happened that generated this memory? Because the flood exists not only in Mesopotamia and in Genesis, it exists in cultures that have no documented historical relation to the Middle East. It exists in India. The Shatapatha Brahmana describes the fish god Matsya warning the sage Manu about an impending flood and instructing him to build a boat. Manu embarks with the sages and with the seeds of all plants. The boat lands on the Himalayas. It exists in Greece. Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus, land on Mount Parnassus, and repopulate the earth. It exists in Mayan traditions. The Popol Vuh describes a flood that destroyed the previous humanity. It exists among Australian Aborigines, among Amazon tribes, among oceanic peoples. More than 200 cultures around the world have some version of the flood story. 200, with no historical contact between most of them, on continents separated by oceans that these cultures did not cross. There are two possible explanations. The first is the traditional religious explanation. The flood actually happened, it was universal, and all these cultures preserve the memory of the same event, because they all descend from the survivors of that event. The memory was transmitted from generation to generation, adapting to local languages and cosmologies, but preserving the core. The second is the explanation that geology and archaeology are slowly constructing, that there indeed were, between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, a series of catastrophic floods resulting from the melting of glaciers from the Ice Age, floods that permanently altered the geography of vast coastal regions inhabited by humans, and that were experiences of destruction so traumatic that surviving generations preserved them as the most significant event of collective memory. The Black Sea, for example, was a freshwater lake until approximately 5600 BC, when the Mediterranean level rose enough to break the natural strait that separated them and flood the region in weeks, increasing the lake area by 30% and permanently covering coastal regions that were inhabited. This amounts on a human scale to the end of the world. But here is what Spinoza would say about this apparent opposition between the two explanations. They are not mutually exclusive. If God, the God of Spinoza, who is not a person sitting on a throne making arbitrary decisions, but the totality of nature and its laws, if this God is the creator of tectonic plates, of the water cycle, of the melting of glaciers, then a catastrophic flood caused by natural processes and a flood sent by God as judgment are the same thing described from two different perspectives. The geologist's perspective describes the mechanism. The survivor's perspective describes the meaning. And the meaning that 200 cultures found in the same type of event, independently of each other, was identical. There was something wrong with humanity. There was an accumulation of behaviors, of patterns, of a way of existing in the world that was unsustainable. And the catastrophe came as a new beginning, as cleansing, as the brutal and traumatic opportunity to start anew in a different way. This is not geology. This is not theology. This is collective psychology. It is humanity looking at its own catastrophes and trying to find in them not only causality, but meaning. And the fact that it found the same meaning, in different languages, on different continents, in different centuries, says something profound about what human beings are, about what we need, about what we seek when the world crumbles around us. Spinoza read these Mesopotamian texts, or at least the accounts that reached him about them, and did not find a threat to Hebrew revelation. he found a confirmation of something he had proposed. That human experience in the face of the transcendent follows patterns that no cultural boundary can contain, and that these patterns, the flood, the survivor, the new beginning, the covenant after the catastrophe, are not just narratives. They are structures of human experience so fundamental that they reappear independently in any human group that undergoes a sufficiently total trauma. Destruction and new beginning are not the story of any specific people. They are the grammar of how human beings understand the relationship between suffering and the possibility of life after suffering. And as long as there are human beings who suffer and who survive, this grammar will continue to be written, in all languages, in all traditions, always with the same arc: the end of the world. The boat, the dove, the mountain, the covenant, the new beginning. There is a phenomenon that Tibetan medicine has known for centuries and that Western science has only begun to seriously investigate in the last decade, with results that the researchers involved describe in private with a mix of fascination and complete bewilderment. The phenomenon is called Tukdam, and what Tukdam describes is this: highly realized Tibetan Buddhist monks who, at the moment of clinical death, heart stopped, breathing ceased, all vital signs extinguished according to any conventional medical criteria, remain in a state that does not correspond to any category that Western biology possesses. The body does not decompose. It remains warm to the touch, especially in the heart area. The face maintains an expression of peace, sometimes described by witnesses as one of active serenity, not the rigidity of a corpse, but something different, something that words do not quite capture. And this state can last for days, sometimes weeks. In a documented case in the 20th century, it lasted 22 days. Tukdam is not Tibetan legend. It is not folklore. It is not pious exaggeration from disciples who cannot accept the death of the master. In 2016, a team of researchers from the Mind and Life Institute, an organization founded by the Dalai Lama in partnership with Western neuroscientists, initiated a formal project to document cases of Tukdam. The project is ongoing. Preliminary results have been presented at scientific conferences and published in peer-reviewed academic journals. What the researchers found was the following. In monks who died in a state of Tukdam and whose bodies were subjected to post-mortem analyses when the state ceased, there were no signs of decomposition compatible with the time elapsed since clinical death. The tissues exhibited a state of preservation that has no explanation within known biological parameters. There is no explanation. These are not the words of a Tibetan monk. They are the words of researchers with PhDs in molecular biology and neuroscience, publishing in peer-reviewed scientific journals. There is no explanation. Spinoza would have paused for a moment in front of this, not out of fear, not out of devotion, out of attention, because this is exactly the kind of phenomenon that his philosophy was equipped to examine without the panic that conventional religion feels in the face of the inexplicable, and without the dismissal that superficial scientism uses as a shield. Spinoza did not believe in miracles in the sense of supernatural violations of natural laws, but he believed, and built an entire philosophy around this, that human beings know only a minimal fraction of the laws that govern nature. That what we call supernatural is often just the natural operating in dimensions that we have not yet mapped. Tukdam, from this perspective, is not a violation of any law. It is a law that we do not yet understand. A capacity of the consciousness, or something related to consciousness, that the Tibetan tradition has developed and documented over centuries, and that Western science is just beginning to examine with the tools it has available. And the tools are still not sufficient. The Tibetan tradition explains Tukdam in the following terms. The monk who dies in a deep meditative state does not immediately leave the body. Consciousness, what the Tibetans call rigpa, the pure consciousness of recognition, remains present in the body for a period that varies according to the degree of spiritual realization of the practitioner. And while this presence remains, the body does not behave like an ordinary corpse. This is not, within Tibetan cosmology, a miracle in the sense of an exceptional event. It is the predictable and documented result of decades of specific contemplative practice. It is a skill that requires extraordinary training, but skill, not magic. The equivalent, perhaps, of a musician who has spent 40 years practicing piano and can do things with 10 fingers that no non-pianist can immediately comprehend, except that here the instrument is not the piano. It is consciousness. And what it can do, at the level of Tukdam realization, surpasses any analogy that the Western world possesses. But there is a second dimension to this story that goes beyond the physical phenomenon. The Tibetan texts that describe the process of death, particularly the Bardo Thodol, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, were translated into English for the first time in 1927 by the Orientalist Walter Evans Wentz, with commentary by the psychologist Carl Jung. Jung was disturbed by what he read. Disturbed in a specific way. He recognized, because the phases described in the Bardo Thodol, the states of consciousness experienced during the process of death, and after it, the lights that appear, the archetypes that emerge, the fears that project as external reality, the possibility of recognizing the nature of one's own consciousness and achieving liberation, all corresponded, with a precision that Jung could not ignore, to structures he had identified in the collective unconscious through decades of dream analysis, delusions, and mystical experiences of patients who had never read a single Tibetan text. The same images, the same sequence, the same internal logic. Jung came to the conclusion that the Bardo Thodol was not merely a Tibetan religious manual. It was a map of the human psyche in extreme conditions, a map that the Tibetan tradition had constructed through millennia of meticulous contemplative observation of what happens to consciousness when taken beyond its usual limits. And this map corresponded to what Western psychology was discovering through completely different paths about the deeper workings of the human mind. Now place this alongside the biblical tradition. The Book of Job, perhaps the most philosophically honest text in the biblical canon, describes a man who undergoes total destruction and, at the most extreme point of his suffering, has an encounter with the divine that is not comforting. It is not the answer Job wanted. It is God speaking from the midst of the whirlwind and asking questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Do you know the paths of death? Not answers, questions. Job's encounter with the divine is, structurally, the same as what the Bardo Thodol describes. Consciousness, taken to the limit of its capacity to endure, finds itself before something it cannot control, name, or comprehend. And this encounter, paradoxically, is described as the most real experience of its existence. More real than previous prosperity. More real than pain. More real than anything that came before. The Tibetan tradition calls what Job encountered Rigpa, the clear luminosity of pure consciousness, which appears at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The Hebrew tradition calls it Shekinah, the divine presence that reveals itself in the desert, in the whirlwind, in the burning bush, in places where the ego no longer has control. Different names, different cosmologies, radically different spiritual practices, the same territory, and the Tibetan monks who die in Tukdam, who remain on the threshold between life and death for weeks, at peace, without decomposition, in a state that science cannot explain, are perhaps the most concrete evidence that this territory is real. That consciousness has dimensions that biology has yet to map. That what traditions call the other shore is not a metaphor. It is an address. There is a plant in the Amazon. Two components. Two different plants that need to be combined in a preparation process that lasts hours, requiring specific knowledge, which varies from tradition to tradition among the indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin. Separated, neither produces significant psychoactive effects in humans. Combined in the right way, they produce one of the most radical experiences that human consciousness can undergo. The question that Western researchers asked when they first had serious contact with this compound was inevitable. How did peoples without access to the scientific method, without laboratories, without the capacity for chemical analysis, how did these peoples discover among the tens of thousands of plants in the Amazon rainforest exactly these two and exactly the combination process that makes them active? The answer that the shamans gave, uniformly, was so simple that researchers did not know what to do with it. The plants taught us. Ayahuasca, this is the best-known name. Although each indigenous tradition has its own name, has been used for at least 1,000 years, possibly much longer, in specific ritual contexts, not as a recreational drug, not as entertainment, as medicine, as diagnosis, as communication with what lies beyond ordinary perception. The shaman who conducts the ceremony, the healer, the ayahuasquero, the vegetalista, depending on the tradition, is not just the one who prepares the compound. He is the mediator between two worlds. He is the one who, through decades of training and accumulated experiences with the plant, has learned to navigate the states of consciousness produced by it and to bring back useful information for the community. Cures for diseases that did not respond to any other treatment. Diagnoses of conditions that the patient had not revealed. Location of missing persons. Identification of relational conflicts that were at the root of physical ailments. These are not reports from credulous followers. They are documented accounts by anthropologists, doctors, and researchers who went into the field without any prior belief in the efficacy of the system and returned with questions that their disciplines were not equipped to answer. In 1960, the ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, a Harvard professor, possibly the greatest expert on psychoactive plants in South America that the Western world has ever produced, spent more than a decade living among Amazonian indigenous peoples documenting the ritual use of plants. What he described in his scientific reports were not primitive ceremonies of superstition. They were medical spiritual systems of a sophistication that had taken centuries to develop and that contained pharmacological knowledge that Western science was rediscovering decades later. Later, in the 1990s, researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology identified that the active compound of ayahuasca, dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, is produced by the human brain itself. It is present in measurable quantities in the central nervous system. It is not a foreign substance introduced from outside. It is an endogenous molecule, produced internally, whose physiological role has yet to be fully understood. What ayahuasca does, biochemically, is amplify and prolong the action of a molecule that already exists within you. This raised a question that the field of neuroscience has yet to resolve. What is the purpose of endogenous DMT? Why does the human body naturally produce a substance that in sufficient concentrations produces experiences of ego dissolution, contact with entities, access to information that the subject could not have through conventional sensory pathways? There is no established answer. There is investigation. But here is the detail that Spinoza would have found most interesting of all. The reports of experiences with ayahuasca, collected from thousands of people from completely different cultures, with no prior preparation in Amazonian indigenous cosmology, with no specific religious expectations, converge on themes that were not suggested by any specific guide or tradition. The dissolution of the boundary between the self and the world, the same experience described by Buddha under the Bodhi tree, the contact with entities that present themselves as more real than anything in ordinary reality, the same type of experience that Moses describes before the burning bush, that Elijah describes in the gentle wind that comes after the fire, the confrontation with everything that has been denied, repressed, avoided in ordinary life, the same that Jung describes as the confrontation with the shadow, the same that Tibetan texts describe as the visions of the bardo, and with a frequency that researchers found statistically impossible to ignore, the encounter with what the participants themselves describe as love, not romantic love, not familial love, a cosmic, impersonal love that is at the same time completely intimate, which has no specific object but permeates everything, which participants invariably describe as the most real thing they have ever experienced. In almost all mystical traditions of the world, this love is the name of God. What Spinoza proposes, and what ayahuasca seems to confirm in a way that pharmacology is not equipped to process, is that access to the divine is not a matter of belonging to the right tradition, of making the right prayers, of following the right rules. It is a matter of consciousness, of reaching states of consciousness in which the barriers that the ego constructs between the self and the rest of reality become sufficiently permeable for the deepest nature of reality to be perceived. The traditions have found different paths to this place, Buddhist meditation, the fasting and isolation of the prophets, Hindu tantric practices, the contemplative work of Christian mystics, the initiation rituals of Amazonian indigenous peoples. Different paths, the same place. And the place, in whatever the exact nature of what happens when consciousness arrives there, is described with words that belong to the vocabulary of all religions without belonging exclusively to any. Vastness, light, presence, love, knowledge that does not come from outside. Recognition of something that has always been there, but that ordinary life hides like a layer of dust covers a mirror. Spinoza called this mirror God or nature. Amazonian shamans call it the forest. Buddhists call it Rigpa. Christians call it the Holy Spirit. The names do not matter. The mirror is the same. There is a room that has existed for 4,000 years. Not the physical room that has been destroyed, rebuilt, modified, looted, buried by time and unearthed by archaeologists in fragments, but the conceptual room, the space it represented, what happened inside it. This room was in the Egyptian temples. In the larger temples, Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Dendera, there was an inner chamber called by the Egyptians the Sanctum Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies, a chamber that only the highest-ranking priests could enter, where the statue of the temple's main god was located, where the most secret and powerful rituals were performed. The Greeks who visited Egypt and left accounts, Herodotus, Plato, Pythagoras, according to tradition, spoke of these temples with a respect that was uncommon in the ancient world. Pythagoras, according to reports, spent 22 years being initiated into the Egyptian mysteries before returning to Greece. What he brought back, mathematics as the language of the cosmos, the transmigration of the soul, geometry as the key to the structure of reality, was, according to him, only the surface of what he had learned. What remained in the depths of the Egyptian temples, Pythagoras did not tell, or he told only to disciples who also did not tell. But there is a text that has reached us, fragmented, poorly preserved, translated from a translation of a translation, but it has arrived. It is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And what it describes, what was the core of the Egyptian mysteries, the reason those temples existed, what the priests spent decades learning, is a journey, the journey that consciousness takes after physical death. The Egyptians called this part of consciousness Ba, something that most translations render as soul, but that is, strictly speaking, closer to what we today call personality, or individual character. And they described the Ba facing, after death, a series of chambers, guardians, tests until reaching what they called the Hall of Two Truths. In the Hall of Two Truths, the heart of the deceased was weighed on a scale. On one side of the scale, the heart. On the other, a feather. The feather of Maat, the goddess who represents truth, justice, cosmic harmony, the ethical order of the universe. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if the life lived had been sufficiently aligned with truth, with justice, with care for others, the deceased passed into Aru, the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if it had been laden with lies, cruelty, neglect, it was devoured by Amit, the creature that is part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, and the deceased ceased to exist in any form, not hell, extinction. Place this Egyptian judgment alongside the judgment described in Abrahamic traditions, the day of final judgment, the book where the deeds are recorded, the scale that weighs good and evil. The decision between eternal reward and punishment, the structure is the same. But there is a difference that Spinoza would have noticed immediately, and that is more important than any similarity. In the Egyptian judgment, the criterion is not faith. It is not the observance of rituals. It is not belonging to any specific people or tradition. The criterion is the heart, the character, the ethical quality of the life lived. The Book of the Dead includes a list, called the Negative Confession, of 42 acts that the deceased declares not to have committed. And this list is extraordinary in its ethical specificity. I did not cause suffering. I did not steal. I did not kill. I did not lie. I was not cowardly. I did not cause hunger. I was not arrogant. I did not pollute the water. I was not deaf to the just word. I did not despise the God of my city. Not, I believed in the correct doctrines. Not, I observed the prescribed rituals. Not, I was born of the right people. The character. Spinoza would read the negative confession and recognize something he proposed as the heart of ethical life, that virtue is not obedience to an external law, but the development of an internal character that acts well because it understands that acting well is acting in accordance with the deepest nature of reality, not out of fear of judgment, out of understanding. The goddess Maat, who represents cosmic harmony, the order that sustains the universe, is not in Egyptian texts a separate entity from the cosmos that judges from the outside. She is the inherent order of the cosmos. She is the principle by which the stars follow their orbits, by which the seasons succeed one another, by which the seed becomes a plant and the plant becomes fruit, and the human heart, when weighed against the feather of Maat, is being measured not against an arbitrary law decreed by a divine legislator. It is being measured against the very structure of the cosmos, against the order that sustains everything. This is, in Egyptian mythological language, what Spinoza proposes in philosophical language, that ethics is not arbitrary, is not conventional, does not depend on any specific revelation to any specific people. Ethics is inscribed in the structure of reality, and human consciousness, when sufficiently developed, can perceive this structure and act in accordance with it. Maat is the Egyptian name for what Spinoza called reason. But there is still another element in the Egyptian mysteries that goes beyond individual ethics. The central myth that sustained all Egyptian religion, the myth that the mysteries of Abydos dramatized in annual rituals, that the Book of the Dead presupposes, that entire temples were built to honor, is the myth of Osiris. Osiris was the king of the gods. He was killed by his brother Set, dismembered, his body cut into 14 pieces and scattered throughout Egypt. His wife Isis traveled the entire country collecting the pieces. She reassembled the body. With her love and her magic, she resurrected Osiris, not completely, not in the same way he was before, but enough for him to father an heir, Horus, who in turn would defeat Set and restore order. The resurrected Osiris becomes the lord of the underworld, the judge of hearts, the ruler of the dimension to which all consciousness directs after death. This myth, and I will let you make the connection without me having to say it out loud because the idea deserves to reach you in its own way. This myth predates the New Testament by more than 2,000 years. The God who dies, the dismembered body, the woman who seeks him, the resurrection, the transformed return, the dominion over death. I am not saying that one derives from the other. I am not making any claims about historical dependence. I am asking Spinoza's question, what is this that appears here and there in this form, with this structure, in this pattern that has no fixed address? What is humanity trying to say when it repeatedly tells, in cultures with no connection between them, the story of a divine being who descends, who dies, who resurrects, and who through his death and resurrection opens a way for the living? What kind of experience is held within this archetype? And what would be necessary? What kind of honesty? What kind of openness? What kind of willingness to be uncomfortable for long enough? To look at this question without rushing to the first answer that confirms what? This is what the essence of the world is all about. It is the vital force that permeates everything, the energy that connects all beings and phenomena. For the Incas, Huaca was the manifestation of the sacred in every aspect of life, from the majestic mountains to the small streams that meander through the land. It was the presence of the divine in every leaf, in every stone, in every human being. This worldview was not limited to a belief or a system of worship. It was a way of being in the world, a way of perceiving the interconnectedness of all things. The Spanish conquistadors, upon arriving in the Andes, could not comprehend this vision. For them, reality was divided between the sacred and the profane, between what was worthy of worship and what was not. They saw Inca rituals as superstition, ignoring the depth of the relationship the Incas had with nature and the cosmos. What the Spanish did not realize was that the Huaca was not merely an object of worship, but a way of understanding existence itself. It was an expression of wisdom that recognized that everything is interconnected and that life is a complex fabric of relationships. The Inca Empire, with its vast network of roads and efficient administration, was a manifestation of this understanding. The ability to organize and sustain such a complex society was not merely a matter of engineering or logistics, it was a matter of harmony with the land and the forces that inhabit it. The Incas cultivated a respectful relationship with nature, recognizing that their actions had consequences and that the health of the land was essential to the health of the community. When the Spanish imposed their own worldview, disregarding the huaca and the wisdom it represented, they not only destroyed temples and idols, they dismantled a way of life that was deeply rooted in the land and culture. What was lost was more than a religion. It was a way of being in tune with the universe. The disconnection that followed had profound repercussions not only for the indigenous peoples, but for all of humanity. The separation between the human and the divine, between the sacred and the profane, has deepened, creating an abyss that we still struggle to overcome. The sixth miracle, therefore, is not merely a matter of history or archaeology. It is a call to re-examine our own relationship with the world. It is an invitation to rediscover the huaca within us and around us. It is a reminder that regardless of where we come from or what traditions we follow, we all share the same land, the same life, the same vital energy that connects us. And like the Incas, we are invited to recognize and honor this connection, to seek harmony in our lives, and to understand that the sacred is not separate from us, but is an intrinsic part of who we are. By reflecting on these miracles, on experiences that transcend cultures and eras, we are led to a deeper understanding of reality, the interdependence of all phenomena, the absence of a separate self, the luminous nature of consciousness. All this invites us to look beyond the divisions we have created and to recognize the unity that permeates existence. The challenge is great, but the reward is even greater. The possibility of living in harmony with the world, of experiencing life in its fullness, and of connecting with the divine that resides within each of us. A point in the world where the divine becomes perceptible. It could be a mountain, an unusually shaped stone, a spring, a confluence of rivers, a place where a lightning bolt struck, a place where someone died in an extraordinary way. It is not that the divine is in this place and not in others. It is that in this specific place, for reasons that may be geographical, historical, or simply mysterious, the membrane between the ordinary and the extraordinary becomes thinner. The Inca priests, the Yahak, the ones who know, spent decades learning to perceive these membranes, to locate them, to work with them, to use the special permeability of these points for purposes that colonial medicine called witchcraft, and that the Incas themselves called healing, communication, alignment with the forces that sustain the world. Spinoza would read about the huacas and immediately recognize what was being described. Because the idea that the divine is not equally distributed in space, that there are points of greater intensity, places where reality becomes thinner and more revealing, is not strange to Abrahamic traditions. Mount Sinai is a huaca. Mount Moriah, where Abraham took Isaac, is a huaca. The Jordan River, where John baptized, is a huaca. The Kaaba in Mecca is a huaca. The Western Wall is a huaca. These peoples never met. They never compared notes. They never agreed to use the same spiritual mechanism to organize the relationship between the human and the divine. And they arrived at the same place. Certain points in physical space carry a charge that others do not. All of humanity, in all cultures, perceives this, and around these points, they build their most sacred stories. But there is something specific in the Andean tradition that goes beyond the idea of a sacred place. The Incas organized the cosmos around a concept called Pachamama, usually translated as Mother Earth, but which is much more complex than this translation suggests. Pacha means simultaneously space and time. Mama is mother, origin, source. Pachamama is the space-time matrix of all existence, not a goddess personified in the Greco-Roman sense, but the very substance of the real, alive, responsive, in constant relation with the consciousnesses that live within it. And the relationship that the Incas maintained with Pachamama was not of passive worship. It was of active reciprocity. Aini, the law of reciprocity, was the organizing principle of all Andean social and spiritual life. You receive from the cosmos, you give back to the cosmos, you take from the earth, you offer to the earth, not as an empty ritual, as a recognition that you are not separate from the system that sustains you. This idea that the human being is not above nature nor separate from it, but is part of a system that demands responsible participation, was the core of Spinoza's philosophy. God or nature, Deus sive natura, not a God who created nature and stands outside observing. A God who is nature, who thinks through the human mind, who feels through the bodies that inhabit the cosmos, who exists in the movement of the stars as much as in the thought of a philosopher in Amsterdam. Pachamama is Deus sive natura in Quechua. 2,000 years before Spinoza was born, we arrive at the moment when we need to ask the question that this entire journey has been building towards. Not about miracles, not about traditions, about you. Because Spinoza did not build his philosophy for people to be impressed by it and continue life exactly as it was. He built it for people to stop, to look at the beliefs they inherited without choosing, at the certainties they never examined, at the fears that silently govern their most important decisions, and do one simple and radical thing. Think, not to arrive at a specific conclusion, not to replace one doctrine with another, to develop what he called libertas, freedom, and which he defined not as the absence of external restrictions, but as the capacity to act from understanding rather than acting from fear. What we have seen so far put together says the following: the human experience of the divine is not the property of any tradition. It appears everywhere there is a human being brave enough to go beyond the surface of ordinary existence, and when it appears, regardless of the language and cosmology that receives it, it produces the same transformations: dissolution of the ego as an absolute entity, contact with something vaster than the individual self, return with an understanding that did not exist before. This does not prove that God exists in the way any specific tradition describes, but it proves something that is, in practice, more important for the life of a concrete human being. It proves that the search is real, that the impulse that leads Buddha to sit under the tree, that leads Moses to climb the mountain, that leads the Amazonian shaman to enter the forest, that leads the Tibetan monk to sit in meditation for decades, that leads the Inca priest to climb a sacred mountain in the cold of dawn. This impulse is not delusion. It is not superstition. It is not weakness. It is the most specifically human part of what we are. No other animal we know seeks what is beyond immediate perception. No other animal builds systems of meaning that attempt to answer not only the how but the why. No other animal confronts its own finitude and asks if there is something on the other side of it. This search is what defines us more than anything else, and it appears everywhere, in all times, in all cultures. Spinoza called superstition not the religious belief itself. He called superstition the religious belief that is based on fear rather than understanding, that obeys rather than understands, that accepts the authority of others on the most fundamental questions of existence rather than developing the capacity to examine them directly. And he said that superstition was universally human, not because humans are stupid, but because fear is powerful and understanding requires work. It requires the willingness to be uncomfortable, to not have answers long enough for better answers to emerge, to look at what you believe with the same critical eye you use to examine what others believe. He knew that this was difficult. He paid the price of trying. But he said, and this was at the heart of everything he wrote, that there was no other way to real freedom. And here we come to what may be the most disturbing detail of the entire journey we have taken together. The 6 miracles we examined, the awakening of Buddha, the creative destruction of Kali, the universal flood, the Tibetan Tukdam, the Amazonian ayahuasca, the Inca huacas and Pachamama, are not exotic curiosities from distant cultures. They are mirrors. Each of them reflects from a different angle something you already know, something that is in your own tradition, in your own personal history, in your own experience of being human in a world that cannot be reduced to any simple explanation. You have felt what Buddha sat to find, that rare moment when the boundary between you and the rest of the world became less rigid, perhaps on a night of silence, in a loss, in the face of something unexpectedly beautiful. You have lived the physics of Kali, the destruction of something you loved, that made space for something that could not exist without that destruction. You carry the memory of a personal flood, a moment when everything that existed before was underwater, and you had to start over. You have intuited, at some moment of extreme clarity, that the boundary between living and dying is thinner than everyday life allows us to perceive. You have accessed by some means music, love, pain, nature, silence, something that was beyond what you could name and that left a residue of certainty that no subsequent rational explanation could completely dissolve. This is not the miracle of any specific tradition. It is the miracle of human consciousness. And it is the only miracle that Spinoza needed to build all of his philosophy. Let's return to Amsterdam, 1677. Baruch de Spinoza is 44 years old. He is ill. Tuberculosis, probably exacerbated by years of inhaling the glass dust from lens polishing work. He lives in a simple room in a friend's house. He eats little, sleeps little. Writes like someone who knows he does not have much time. On a Sunday in February 1677, while his friends went to Mass, Spinoza died. Alone in the room, peacefully according to witnesses, without visible agony, like someone who had, throughout his life, practiced acceptance of finitude as part of the nature of things, and who reached the end without finding reason to revise that practice. He had been excommunicated at 23. Critique pode realizar. É uma prática que envolve a mente e o coração, uma entrega ao conhecimento que se transforma em amor. Spinoza nos convida a amar a realidade em sua totalidade, a aceitar a complexidade e a beleza do mundo como ele é, sem a necessidade de simplificações ou dogmas. Esse amor intelectual é um convite para nos tornarmos participantes ativos na busca pela verdade, para nos engajarmos com o mundo de maneira profunda e significativa. Ele nos desafia a transcender as limitações do ego e a nos conectar com algo maior, algo que nos une a todos os seres humanos, independentemente de suas crenças ou tradições. Ao fazer isso, não apenas expandimos nossa própria compreensão, mas também contribuímos para um diálogo mais amplo e inclusivo sobre a natureza da existência. Essa prática de amor intelectual é, portanto, uma forma de resistência contra a fragmentação e a divisão que muitas vezes caracterizam as interações humanas. Em vez de ver as diferenças como barreiras, Spinoza nos encoraja a vê-las como oportunidades para aprendizado e crescimento. Ele nos lembra que, ao nos abrirmos para a diversidade de experiências e perspectivas, enriquecemos nossa própria jornada e nos aproximamos da verdade. Assim, a filosofia de Spinoza não é apenas uma reflexão teórica, mas um chamado à ação. Um convite para que cada um de nós se torne um agente de mudança em nosso próprio contexto, promovendo a compreensão, a empatia e o amor em todas as nossas interações. Ao final, a mensagem de Spinoza é clara. A verdadeira sabedoria não reside apenas no conhecimento, mas na capacidade de amar e compreender o mundo e a nós mesmos em toda a sua complexidade. Essa é a essência do amor intellectualis Dei, um amor que nos transforma e nos conecta, que nos inspira a buscar a verdade e a viver de maneira autêntica e plena. The human being can achieve, because when you understand reality, you get closer to what reality is, and what reality is, in its entirety, perceived without the filter of the ego that needs things to be a specific way, is what Spinoza called God. Therefore, to understand is, literally, to approach God, not metaphorically, structurally. This changes what it means to be religious. It does not eliminate ritual, community, the specific practice of each tradition. These have value, real value, value that Spinoza recognized even after being expelled from his community. Traditions carry accumulated wisdom. They carry developed and tested ways of modifying the filter of consciousness. They carry stories that point to the territory of interest. What Spinoza eliminates is exclusivism, the idea that your way of pointing is the only valid one. The idea that those who point differently are necessarily wrong or lost or condemned, because the finger is never the moon, and the moon is the same, regardless of which finger is pointing at it. The 6 miracles we examined, from the awakening of Buddha to Ande and Pachamama, are 6 fingers. 6 ways that humanity has developed, in different corners of the world and at different moments in history, to point to the same place. Each carries something that the others do not carry in the same way. Buddhism carries a psychology of consciousness with a precision that no other tradition has achieved. Hinduism carries a cosmology that integrates destruction and creation without needing to deny either. Mesopotamian traditions carry the collective memory of catastrophes that have shaped human psychology more deeply than any doctrine. Tibetan Buddhism carries a map of death and dying with a sophistication that modern medicine is just beginning to take seriously. Amazonian traditions carry knowledge of consciousness and its possibilities that neuroscience will take decades to adequately map. Egyptian mysteries carry a cosmological ethics, the weighing of the heart, that places character above belonging as the criterion of what we are. And Andean traditions carry an understanding of reciprocity, aini, which is perhaps the most direct antidote to the ecological crisis that Western civilization has produced by treating nature as a resource rather than a relationship. No tradition alone carries everything. Together, they point to something that no human nomenclature can fully contain. Spinoza does not ask us to become everything at once. It is not possible and would not be honest. He asks us to recognize the limitation of any single perspective, including our own, to keep the question open about what other traditions can teach us, to treat the search for understanding not as a project that has a completion date, but as the most genuine way to honor whatever it is that we call divine. Because a God that only exists while you do not ask questions is a very fragile God. And reality, what Spinoza called God or nature, what Buddhists call Tathata, what the Incas called Pachamama, reality does not need your protection. It needs your attention. Let us return to the beginning, to the basement of the British Museum where George Smith reads the tablets of Gilgamesh and begins to strip away his astonishment, to the simple room in Amsterdam where Spinoza dies alone on a Sunday afternoon, to the Bodhi tree where Siddhartha opens his eyes and is no longer the same, to the Hall of Two Truths where a heart is weighed against a feather, to the Amazon rainforest where the healer descends to the underworld and returns with a name that no one had said to him, to the Andean mountain where the Inca priest rises in the cold of dawn to converse with something that has no proper name in any language, to Tibet where a monk dies in peace and his body awaits in silence for weeks. What all these stories have in common is not the miracle itself. It is the courage to go to the limit. Buddha went to the limit of physical and mental resistance and sat still when everything in his body and mind screamed for him to get up. The Amazonian healer goes to the limit of individual consciousness and crosses to the other side, knowing that the return is not guaranteed. The Tibetan monk goes to the limit of life and remains at that threshold with a serenity that contradicts everything biology describes as possible. Spinoza went to the limit of honest thought, knowing what it would cost, having seen what it cost, and did not turn back. And what did they find, each in their own way, in languages that do not fully translate into one another? They found that the limit is not the end. It is where things become more real, not easier. More real, more true. Closer to something that has no name, but that you recognize when you encounter it, with a certainty that no external argument can produce, and that no external argument can truly undo. You have come this far. You have crossed 6 traditions, 6 miracles, 6 ways that humanity has found to point to the unnameable. You have traversed the cold and passionate geometry of a man who was expelled from everything he knew for refusing the comfort of easy answers. And now you are here, at this point, with a question that I will not answer for you. Because the answer that matters, your answer, the one that pertains to your life, your faith, your way of being in the world, that you already have, somewhere below the noise. Spinoza spent his entire life trying to polish lenses clear enough for people to see more sharply, not to see what he saw, to see what has always been before them, but that the fog of fear, habit, and unquestioned authority had made invisible. This video was an attempt at the same gesture, not an answer, a lens. What you do with it is entirely yours.